Today you get me, which is good in one way in that you don't get me later on, and is probably not so good in that I'm not the Dean of Law. But I think what I've got to say is something that goes to the core of this subject. And it touches all of the bases. In particular, it touches what Luke would have gone over in greater detail than I will today, and that is the relationship between law, the legal system, and justice. The three of them are not necessarily interchangeable, and those three concepts may in fact mean different things to different people in different circumstances. So today, underpinning this story that I'm about to reveal to you is an examination of those concepts. This is a story also which puts front and centre the concept of context. I mentioned to my tutorial group on Monday that context, as an historian I can't help myself, but context explains almost everything, but not quite. But without it, your explanation is somewhat deficient. So this is a story which puts context front and centre, and I think it's a portable, universal concept that would run through any problem that anyone doing this subject has confronted, or any problem that anyone in this subject wants to confront once they finish the subject. So context is very important. This is a story it's a local story. It's Wollongong's Erin Brockovich, where I'm not Erin Brockovich. And it's a story involving several players. It involves these players, Australian Iron and Steel, then a subsidiary of BHP, Wollongong City Council, the suburb of Cringilla, and government agencies. And this is a lecture that I've given a couple of times and I've never been satisfied with it, largely because I've tried to be too cute with it and reveal a wham bam thank you ma'am punchline at the end. So I've decided to dispense with that and just deal with that up front. This is a story of a proposal by Australian Iron and Steel to construct a multi-million tonne coal wash dump in the middle of what is arguably Wollongong's most disadvantaged suburb. And this story broke on the 3rd of February 1982 after yours truly had taken up his appointment as Director of Migrant Health on the 2nd of February 1982. So this is a story from both an insider's point of view as a senior health bureaucrat and also as someone who is running a double game as a community activist by night with a cape and trying to keep below the radar of my bosses who were desperate to sack me for being involved in this. And it's a story, as I said, which goes to the very issue of context. It's a story which I think goes to the very issue of the law, the legal system, and what you and I might see as justice. So in broad terms, the proposal was this. Unbeknownst to the people of Cringilla, Australian Iron and Steel had been having negotiations with Wollongong City Council possibly as early as mid-1981 without any of this being revealed to councillors, without any of this being revealed to the public, about what to do with its coal wash waste. As you know, or may not know, the Steelworks has access to some of the world's best coking coal, which is along the escarpment and between here and, say, Picton along the highlands. And the better the quality the coke, the better the quality the steel. But when you make coke, you are also left with a waste, coal wash waste. And it's something that needs to be disposed of. And in 1981, the Steelworks had gone to council and said, we have a problem with this coal wash waste, we want to get rid of it. And for council, I think you can read the late Francis Neville Arkell, the Lord Mayor, said, I've got just the site for you. You could put this on a hill in Cringilla and all would be well. So the proposal was no small proposal. We'd been getting rid of coal wash waste around Wollongong in a variety of ways for a long period of time. This university is largely built on coal wash waste. If those of you who were students here back when I started, when dinosaurs roamed the earth and Hadrian was just finishing his wall in England, would know that some of the car parks at that stage imitated Passchendaele on the Western Front, meets a deserted industrial landscape, and it was coal wash. Most of the football fields in Wollongong are built on coal wash. Most of the netball courts in Wollongong are built on coal wash waste. So this is something we'd been getting rid of. But the steelworks there's only so many netball courts you can build, there's only so many universities you can build, and the steelworks keeps producing coal wash waste and wants to get rid of it. So the proposal is a large one. It involved the purchase of 48 hectares of land at Cringilla, some photos of which I'll show you in a moment, and at least 7 million tonnes of coal wash waste to be dumped over a 3 to 5 year period, 640 coal truck journeys a day from 6 in the morning till 8 in the evening, 365 days of the year. No small proposal. And Cringilla was partly selected because BHP had largely constructed the playgrounds at Cringilla Public School back in an earlier time from coal wash waste. So they thought that from that small project, a larger project could develop. So the size of this project was something the like of which we had never seen in Wollongong before in terms of the disposing of industrial waste. Context, as I said before, is almost everything. So 1981, 1982, we're just about to hit the world crisis in steel. We're just about to see significant retrenchments from the steelworks. We're just about to see the potential for the beginning of the end of Wollongong. I mean, I think this was something that was seriously discussed. We didn't dispatch councillors and their advisors to places like Youngstown in America and Kirby in England to look at what we would do after steelworks had been closed. We didn't dispatch them there for nothing. So the idea of Wollongong becoming a ghost town is fairly significant. To give you an idea of how ghost-like it had become, in 1981, 1982, my wife and I were looking for a house. We wanted to start a family and we'd vowed never to have a child be raised on the 5th floor of Glengareth in North Wollongong, which is where we were living. And to buy a house in 1982, 1983 was something unusual. I can remember going into a 4-bedroom house in Fig Tree with swimming pool, 3-car garage, fully furnished, and the agent saying to me, "Make me an offer." He says, "The house is listed at around about 200. He said, "But if you can come up with 60, you can have it." 60,000 bucks. The house we eventually bought, which wasn't that one, was a bargain of similar measure. So with the sudden retrenchment of 16,000 men, I use the word men precisely, and the feeder industries which those men were associated with attracted international attention. We had never seen the like of this in Wollongong before, probably exceeding what had gone on in the Great Depression. So this proposal is situated against a context. It's situated against a context of the big Australian, BHP, Australia's best and largest steelworks, which is about to go splat. So 7 to 8 million tonnes of coal wash waste in Cringilla, 640 coal truck journeys a day, 6 a.m. till 8 p.m, 365 days of the year, including Easter Sunday and Christmas Day. And so really, when you start to think about that, this story, even before we get to the rest of the story, this story is starting to get some very interesting dimensions. It's a story involving power. This is no insignificant company, BHP. wasn't called the Big Australian for nothing. It's a very, very powerful organisation. This university exists not largely but significantly because of a grant of BHP of the land that we're on. This was formerly BHP land, and BHP wasn't just in the business of being pedagogically generous. It clearly wanted a university which could provide a captive market for its own workforce. So there was benefits in giving the land to the university, to the government. But this is BHP land. BHP still has representatives on the University Council, and it's not a player with no significance still in Wollongong. So it's got ethical issues, as we'll see in a moment. It's got moral issues. It's got legal issues. It's got legal issues going to professional responsibilities of agencies like the City Council, and what rights do ordinary folk at Cringilla have? And we'll get onto them in a moment. It's about a small suburb, arguably Wollongong's most disadvantaged suburb, facing an enormous threat. It had never faced a threat like this before, and in the face of the threat largely posed by the employer of the overwhelming majority of people at Cringilla, what do those people do? So the subtext of this could be, how would each of you respond if you were in this situation? And how would you respond if you had come from Bitola or Ohrid in Macedonia and you had left school in second class, and when you were admitted to Port Kembla Hospital for a minor or major surgery, you signed your name with a cross because you could not write? Or how would you respond if you had only gone to second class and were marginally fluent only in your first language, and certainly not fluent in English, the language of discourse in this area? And how would you have responded if you thought that because your employer, who had brought you out from Yugoslavia, the former state of Yugoslavia, and BHP very cleverly had a recruitment office next to the Australian Embassy in Belgrade, how would you feel if you thought that you owed your life to your employer, and here was your employer doing something in the suburb in which you lived, and you thought that if you spoke publicly against this, you may well be deported? How would you have responded to this? Could you win? And that was the situation that residents of Cringilla faced on the 3rd of February 1982 when the story broke in the Illawarra Mercury, and the overwhelming majority of people in Cringilla did not believe they could win. 18 months later, they had won a significant victory. So this is a story about how we go from seemingly impossible odds of the Erin Brockovich-esque level to a victory which was bigger than that which residents thought that they could ever win. But before we get to that, we have to look at, I can't help myself, I'm an historian, we have to look at context. Cringilla begins round about the time that the steelworks begins. The Hoskins family transferred the steelworks from Lithgow to Port Kembla at the end of the 20s after having negotiated some very, very generous deals with the state government. Generous deals with state governments and not just the domain of the Tripodis and the Keneallys. It's been going on for some time. Not long after the steelworks arrives and the Depression hits, these advertisements begin to appear from local real estate agents, and they're kind of ironic because they pitch the line of health, particularly to menfolk. So if you live close to your work, sickness won't worry you. In actual fact, if you live close to your work, sickness would ultimately worry you because you would get sick. And you could nip home, you wouldn't have to cycle from Balgownie, you wouldn't have to catch the train or the bus, you wouldn't have to drive your car, which you didn't have, and there were no outer suburbs in Wollongong developing at that time. So you worry all the time, you're rushing home, you move closer to your work, and the punchline at the bottom is, there's no place like home when there's sickness in the family. If your home is near your work, you are handy if you wanted, but if you live miles away from your job, you lose time when illness visits your family. Moral. Live close to your work in your own home. Any estate agent where you work will gladly tell you how you can obtain your own home with a few minutes walk from your job. And at that point, you would think that we're about to enter some golden age. We've got one of the world's, soon-to-be world's, best practice, best operating, best quality steelworks being developed in the area. It's going to be the economic saviour, the economic powerhouse of the region. It will link mines, it will link into ER&S, metal manufacturers, Australian fertilisers. It will link into the inner harbour and the outer harbour. So we've got it looking good. And if you move to Cringilla, if you could believe the words of the real estate agents, you would have it made. Let's fast forward the tape a little bit, and we see that Cringilla has some interesting subtexts to this. So in the 1950s, when pollution, industrial pollution, is starting to become world known, and particularly the downside of it. So we've had the London fog, which claims at least 20,000 lives. We've had the Denora fog smog problem in Europe. We've had the Meuse Valley smog problem in Belgium. We've had the Poza Rica smog problem in Mexico. So by the end of the 50s, the relationship between industrial pollution and health is well known. I mean, Tony Abbott and others may well say that this is crap and that there is no link, but the link in the 1950s, just that Tony hasn't kept up with his reading, that the link was well known in the 1950s that excessive levels of pollution will do your health no good at all. And in Cringilla, this comes home to roost big time, because Cringilla becomes one of the worst addresses in Australia. By the time the State Pollution Control Commission, or its earlier version, the Air Pollution Advisory Committee of the Department of Health, which becomes the State Pollution Control Commission, starts measuring pollution, the highest levels in Australia, indeed the highest levels in the Southern Hemisphere, and amongst the highest readings in the world, occur in Cringilla. So if you lived in Cringilla, you were getting out of your roof every 2-3 months about a dozen kerosene tins of dust. Now, given the dust is pretty fine and compacts, it's not like putting stones into a bucket. Dust, you can get a lot of dust into a bucket. But if you're getting large numbers of buckets full of dust, you've got a lot of dust. If this was once every decade, probably not as serious. Every 2 or 3 months, fairly serious. And what we find in the 1950s and the 1960s is that the levels of industrial pollution readings at Cringilla are of the order of 500 to 600 tonnes per square mile per month. It's not the largest reading we've ever had in the Illawarra. The largest reading we ever had was in the 1980s on the number 3 jetty, where the readings were the equivalent of 2,000 tonnes per square mile per month, which is about the consistency of the brick wall that I'm standing in front of. And not surprisingly, the waterside workers went on strike that day. It was difficult to go on strike because they couldn't see their other workers to actually convene the meeting, but they eventually did convene the meeting and they walked off the job. So it's one of the worst addresses. It's one of the few places in the world where you can actually share a back fence with the steelworks. Not too many other places in the world where you can hit the cricket ball or the tennis ball against the back fence, and over the back fence is the number 3 blast furnace. But you can at Cringilla. Highest levels of pollution. It's also, after these advertisements hit the scene in the 1950s and the steelworks truly responds to post-war economic demands, we have chain migration. It becomes the suburb for chain migration, and it wasn't unusual in the 50s and 60s for 3 people to be living in the same house, generally 3 males, sharing the same bed, not at the same time, I hasten to add. So someone would come home from night shift and the person on day shift would have left the bed, that person would get into the bed, and so it would go around. And they would save money, those men would save money and then bring their families out from Europe not live in Cringilla but go and build large mansions at Ferry Meadow, Balgownie or wherever. So this rolls on, and that can only roll on while you're getting a weekly pay packet. As soon as that stops, your capacity to bring people out from Europe or capacity to have the McMansion or whatever is seriously terminated. It wasn't just the worst address in Australia because of its location or because of the amount of pollution, but it had no community facilities. Very few playing fields, very few, no health clinics, doctors in short supply, etc., etc. It had been the subject of several government inquiries. In fact, government surveyors and sociologists had been trawling through Cringilla for a long period of time before the steelworks decided that they would turn it into one of Australia's largest industrial waste tips. And it wasn't until the 70s, till the Whitlam government comes along and starts having a comprehensive community health program, that we get a community health centre. I'm happy to say the house is still there. It should have a blue heritage plaque on it, seeing I worked there. And I had the little office out the back next to the toilet, which is really cool. And the composition of the population there is important. Mainly Southern European. Cringilla Public School, I think, now speaks at least 90 languages across the school, mainly Macedonian, Turkish, Lebanese, Maltese, Greek and Italian. Then in the 70s we start to get an influx of Vietnamese migrants, and then at the end of the 80s with the troubles in the Middle East we start to get a very vibrant population from the Middle East. And all the while this is going on, the steelworks is responding to what it thinks is a success story. So if you can see, I think this is Steel Street. Not too many places in Australia at the end of your street can you have, you know, a large blast furnace, you know, the materials that are going to go in the blast furnace and all the other accoutrements that go with a full-on breathing metallic monster called a steelworks. But the BHP certainly had that. And to give you some idea of the power, the BHP cartoon in the Herald in the 1980s, you know, I'll BHP whenever I like. And it talked about the success story of Cringilla. The success story it put in these terms. This is from an official BHP publication, and it said, "Here are round-headed little Turkish children, bullet-headed Poles, olive-skinned Greek children as fat as butter, exotic slow-eyed Lebanese, squat little Italians, the occasional blue-eyed blonde Aryan, in this case he is Dutch, and happy-go-lucky Maltese, and more of course." And with corporate attitudes such as these, it's hardly surprising that a dump in the middle of Cringilla could actually be thought of. So by the time the dump proposal comes around, some of these attitudes, and certainly this one, is well in the minds of BHP directors. So those who sat in William Street, Melbourne, for the board meetings, these sort of attitudes which appeared in their own publications were not coming from the pen of a left-wing dissident.
May I throw something in there?
Yes.
1970, I was a union delegate in the steelworks. In 1970, shortly before Christmas, we got about 200 Turks coming into the tin mill. They were standing there, and I, as union delegate, wanted to go and want to communicate with them. There was one Turkish lieutenant there who spoke a little bit of English. The rest of the men couldn't even speak or write in their own language properly, and he told me that they all believed that they came here as guest workers, like they did to Germany. They didn't even know that they had.
Okay, Pat. Yeah, just can you just summarise it briefly, Hans? Push the button. That's it. Go now.
Well, 200 Turkish migrants came into the steelworks in 1970, shortly before Christmas, and I made contact with a police lieutenant who spoke a little bit of English, and he told me that the majority of those people were literate in their own language, and none of them spoke any English, and that they believed that they came to the steelworks as guest worker like other Turks went to Germany for a period when they could go back and didn't know that they had to stay here for 2 years.
Yeah, we have a very interesting arrangement in terms of power that's going on at the steelworks. This would require another 3 lectures, but the steelworks was very clever in the 50s, 60s and 70s in making certain that work gangs didn't have very much in common, particularly language, and it was in their best interests to make certain that they had a workforce which wasn't predisposed to being industrially disputatious. So throughout the 60s and 70s, then the jumping off point for those who come to Cringilla is the starting point for a better life. I can tell you, as bad as life is in Cringilla with the environmental amenity, it is a long way ahead of what is at Bithla and Lake Ochrid. It is a long way ahead in terms of your life chances. So for many people there, this is an advance and an advantage that they might not ever have had in their own country. So the lack of facilities, I want you to remember this because it becomes fundamental to the story. But we need to look at something about Australian Iron and Steel. This is was a subsidiary company in the 80s of BHP, the largest steelworks in the Southern Hemisphere. It had been in Wollongong since 1927-28. It had never been until the in terms of council taking out legal action against the steelworks, council had not once prosecuted the steelworks for air pollution, probably because the steelworks is one of its largest ratepayers, and the advice that council was getting was political advice. You can't penalise someone that employs such a large number of men, as opposed to legal advice. But I might have a conversation off the record with Harold about that later. It's the largest employer in the region by a long way. It owns ships, it owns harbours, it owns rail freight, it owns railway lines, it owns coal mines, it owns trucks, and it believed it owned lives. It believed it owned hearts and souls of people at Cringilla. And this coal wash dump proposal comes as a bit of a shock to them, the way it pans out. It's not only economically powerful, this is when BHP Shares meant something, but it was also politically powerful and socially powerful. In the 1960s, it employs about 30,000 men, overwhelmingly migrant, overwhelmingly men. And it's not until Diana Cavell and others come along and take on the Jobs for Women campaign. It's interesting that she's doing her PhD, she's a Wollongong person. The only 2 times that BHP have been defeated were the Jobs for Women campaign and this. Every other time BHP has won.
11 men for 1 woman.
Absolutely. So the political power, we could go on to this, and to give you some idea of how politically powerful it had been, prior to the proposal, there was an explosion at the coke ovens which costs the lives of several men. Under normal circumstances, you may well have seen you or me in court on serious charges. The steelworks was fined $500 per man who died as a consequence of the industrial accident. So the scene is set here for David versus Goliath. So the proposal comes along, and people in Cringilla are dumbfounded that how could a proposal such as this be proposed for their suburb in areas that they thought were not going to provide them with any problems for the rest of their lives. So if we can just have a quick look at these photos. The coal wash dump was to be as high as the water tower in this photo, and coming down the hill to within 10 feet of people's back fences, stepped and tiered. And this is looking north towards the Cringilla Public School, which is there, which is built on coal wash in many ways. And the company had pointed to it as being rehabilitated coal wash. The fact that they were growing trees on the site which resembled Japanese bonsais, and they'd been growing there for 20 years, gave the Commissioner some interesting questions of the steelworks. Now, one of the things that underpinned the steelworks proposal was that people who lived around the perimeter of this site accorded the hill on which the millions of tonnes of coal wash were to be dumped, accorded that no environmental significance whatsoever. And we'll come to that in a moment. So the proposal, 7 million tonnes, 640 coal truck journeys a day, 3 to 5 years, is released. What do people in the community do? This is a community which is poor. It gives new meaning to poor. They're unemployed. Many of them are damaged physically. Many of them don't speak English. The majority of them who work at the steelworks. What do we do? Small coalition forms. Very small. It was so small that it could have had their annual general meetings in a phone box. About 4 people meet in my office and say, we must do something about this. Now, just coincidentally, I'd just gotten my PhD the week before this proposal comes out. It was on a history of industrial and environmental pollution in Port Kembla. In some ways, I'm the world's most qualified person to deal with this problem because I've just done a PhD. But in many ways, I'm the world's least qualified person. Although raised in a working class suburb, come from a housing commission suburb with parents who didn't go past third year, no one in my family, I have over 90 cousins, no one in my family had ever graduated from high school. I'm the first person to ever walk onto a university site, let alone get a degree. I'm not working class any longer. I've forgotten my working class roots in some ways, and I've never lived in Cringilla, and I don't have any language other than English. And I don't know what it's like to live this life. So what can I do about this? So we get a variety of people together and they form a committee called the Cringilla Coal Wash Dump Protest Committee. It has it has no members technically. The organisation was a letterhead organisation. So every time council or the steelworks said something, because my office had facilities, had an electric typewriter, we could write a press statement and send it off to the Mercury. And as I knew people at the Mercury and I knew people at Channel 4 and I knew people at ABC and other radio stations, we could get the press release out quickly. You only have to put a letterhead and say something like, a packed meeting last night unanimously decided, 5 people, well, it was packed, yes, it was a small room, we're all sitting on one chair, and it was unanimous. Yes, I can distinctly remember a vote, I think. A lot of hands went up, and it sent a very interesting message. If our opponents, if our enemies would have actually deconstructed who the organisation was, they would have seen it as being a bit of a hollow man. So my story is that of a person working inside the health department while at night working as a community activist. While all this is going on, my wife is pregnant with our first son, our only child, and my wife, I don't want to go into too much detail here, but my wife can only sleep when I'm in the bed. So she goes to bed, I go to bed, she goes to sleep, I get up. and I creep into my room. This is pre-laptops, this is pre-computers, and I start to do all sorts of interesting things. And then before she wakes up, I crawl back in. So while she's going through pregnancy, I'm working on about an hour's sleep a night and running my job in the day and running a community campaign, or helping to run a community campaign during the night, in the morning, early hours of the morning. So we decide that while the community organisation can do a lot of good, it would be really good if we got the health department on side. And here is where some interesting things began to occur. Because not long after I start to raise this as a health issue within the health department, I suddenly think that the health department is not there to work on anyone's health. I began to see this as an agency of somebody else. So I can remember doing a little study, a very crude study, looking at admission rates to Port Kembla Hospital for upper respiratory tract infections by postcode, and finding that people from Cringilla outnumbered everyone. And I gave this little paper to Wollongong City Council. And I prefaced my remarks because as a public servant I wasn't permitted to speak without the regional director or the minister's approval, and I was never going to get that. So I spoke in my capacity as person who just done a PhD. And I specifically said that I'm not here representing the Department of Health. I can remember the date of this. This was the night before we won the America's Cup. And it was my big claim to, potential big claim to fame, because the next day it was front page news on the Herald, except that we'd won the America's Cup and I was blotted out by a wraparound. So I never really got to be on the front page of the Herald. But anyway, I was reported as the Health Department's Dr. Glenn Mitchell, which meant that at 8:30 plus 10 seconds, my boss rang me and said, "You are on a disciplinary," yes, another one, "and you'll be in the regional director's office at 9 o'clock and you can bring a lawyer if you want." So I turn up, and being a smart ass, I don't think I need a lawyer. And the regional director says, "Well, you know, this is pretty simple. You'll be packing your bags, cleaning your desk out by lunchtime." Because the report in the Mercury and the Herald today has quoted you as the Health Department's Dr. Glenn Mitchell, and you're not supposed to talk about this, la la la. And I said, could you possibly conceive of the fact that the Mercury might have made a mistake? I mean, I know that this is an organ of great truth and accuracy, despite having got the date wrong on one Anzac Day, when it put the date as April the 24th. I said, perhaps the Mercury has made a mistake. He got stunned as though Muhammad Ali had just hit him with a punch and thought, a mistake? I said, maybe you should ring council and see what the exact record was. So he rings council and he finds out to his shock that I'd said I'm not to be quoted. His then next move was what of the next things would you do? Would you, after having found out, would you ring the Mercury? A, would you ring the Mercury and berate them? B, would you ring BHP? C, would you not ring anyone and apologise to me? Or D, call someone in and say, we've made a humongous mistake? What would you do? I would have done any of them but B. He picks up the phone on speed dial and phones the general manager of the steelworks and apologises. And at that point I'm thinking, who am I working for? The health department or the steelworks? So this starts an enormous fight within the department. While this is going on and the steelworks is beginning to crumble and the economy is beginning to crumble, a friend of mine has phoned me from Canberra saying, Glenn, the Hawke government tomorrow is about to unleash large sums of money for community employment programs. But people need to be on the dole first. I've just finished teaching some students from here. I ring them and say, get yourself on the dole because I want to hire you on this community employment program. You can only call people for interview for the project if they're on the dole. So I put in an application for $500,000, which we get, which provides the typewriter, provides desks, provides all sorts of things, including 13 cars. One of the great days of my life was to go to Dwyer's at Wollongong and say I'd like 13 Tiranas. Yes, I'd like a blue. No, I don't like the green. It's a bad colour. I'd have 2 gold ones. So 13 Tiranas. Great day. And I got 13 staff to go with the 13 Tiranas, including a researcher who I'd formerly just finished teaching at the University of Wollongong, Sylvia Senyuk. And I've got a class act. She goes on to become a senior bureaucrat in the health department herself. And I say, right, we're going to be doing, instead of doing an essay, we're taking the essay from the academy and now we're putting it to real use. We're going to do something with our talents here to stop what's going on in Cringilla. Okay, so we hit upon a brilliant plan of writing to every steelworks in the world, the top 500 steelworks, asking them how they dispose of their coal wash waste. In the meantime, I've convinced the regional director that this was going to be an environmental disaster, and could we go and talk with the head poo bar in central office in the McKell building in Sydney and convince him that we should be able to oppose this at a public inquiry. So off we trot, we get up there and he says, this doesn't seem to... a guy had provided a briefing paper within the Department of Health, a detailed, intensive argument of 1¼ A4 pages of coherent prose, saying that he thought this was one of the best proposals ever seen in Wollongong. He'd never been to Wollongong. I don't think he could find Wollongong on the map. He'd never read the proposal. He'd read a report of it somewhere, he thought, and this was the advice that was given to the Minister and to the Chief Medical Officer of the state. So when I said, well, look, that's crap, and to quote Tony Abbott, and that we could actually do better than this, he said, you're wasting my time, could you please leave? So we come back to Wollongong, In the meantime, the 500 letters have gone out, and shocked to our horror, we're starting to get replies. We're starting to get replies from North Korea, South Korea, we're starting to get replies from China, Turkey, all over the world, and not one of them said that they would dispose of their coal wash in the same way. Not one. All of them are horrified about this proposal. So I go back to the regional director and I say, well, regional director, perhaps we should go back and see the head poo bar in the McKell building. And because here's the evidence. So I bundle all the letters into a box and we go up and see him again. He's more than annoyed this time. He's already dealt with me once. He's already got the internal advice, 1¼ A4 pages. What does he want to see me for from Wollongong? I'm a pest. So I take the box of letters and I tip the box of letters onto his desk. I thought, well, if nothing else, you're going to have a long time putting these back into this box, dude. So if you knock me back, then there's a bit of inconvenience for you. So I say, well, we've done this, this and this, and begrudgingly he says, okay. Now, that took 12 months. I might also say that when he left his job, he went to work as an advisor for the Tobacco Institute. I'm sad, in a way, to report that he died of lung cancer. So we're kind of on a roll here, and so we've got permission to speak at a public inquiry. Or no, we've got permission to speak publicly. We then start to negotiate with other government departments, particularly the Ethnic Affairs Commission, to put pressure on the Commissioners of Inquiry to convene a public inquiry, because you can have public inquiries in New South Wales, or you could have under the old Environment Planning and Assessment Act, because those dealing with coal-related issues. This is coal wash, it's coal-related, thus it's got to have a commission of inquiry. At this point, BHP are truly getting very angry because this looked like a lay-down misère. The Lord Mayor had given them the advice to buy the land. They'd bought the land at bargain basement prices. They had the trucks, they had the waste, and they'd put out, before it was necessary to put out an EIS, they put out the first and only EIS in New South Wales voluntarily, along the lines of what jolly good corporate people are we, which has in the centre of it a threat, which says something like, the argument went something like this: Steelworks produces waste. Waste is important. If the steelworks doesn't produce waste, the works will close. Cringilla is very important to dispose of this waste. If it's not allowed to be disposed there, the steelworks would close. So when pointed out to the Commissioner that this was more than a threat, a steel hand in a very, very awkward steel glove, the Commissioner was not impressed. So negotiations proceed and we get permission to have a commission of inquiry. Then we've got to produce a submission, and central to this submission were interviews with every person who lived around the perimeter of the proposed coal wash dump site. And this took an amazing turn, because this is a group of people who had previously been disempowered. In fact, they'd probably given you meaning to the word disempower. They'd never spoken publicly. They'd rarely spoken about this privately for fear that they would be overheard. Having married into a Serbian-Romanian family, when I go to visit my mother-in-law, now who's in her mid-80s, we're now down to the third sentence before the war is spoken of. And we're down to about the fifth sentence before Tito is mentioned in Yugoslavia, or Ceausescu is mentioned in an over afternoon tea. And when I tell you that my mother-in-law cried and cheered on the afternoon, on the day that, on Christmas Day, when in 1989 was shown that Ceausescu was blown away, you get some idea that these things run, for those of us who have one language, one culture, who've never moved out of a monocultural situation, these things run deep. Deep to the point which white monocultural Australians know nothing about. So we give these people the opportunity to speak, and they describe and ascribe a range of environmental values and environmental perceptions and environmental significance to that hill which no one could ever have dreamed of. So when you get someone in halting Turkish tell the interpreter, under the guarantee of complete anonymity, that what you say, you will not be quoted in the inquiry, and I've convinced the Commissioner that if you want to speak to him, we can have an in-camera session and you can come in the back door, no one will ever see you, and you can tell him what you want with an interpreter. Once we unlock that, we were just blown away. So 99.9% of all respondents around the perimeter of this site said, this will be a disaster in my life. And it will be a disaster because I've had my left leg amputated, and one of the only joys I get in life is looking at that hill. That is powerful ammunition. And for the Commissioner, we were able to succeed in reducing the Commissioner to tears by recounting and describing these environmental values that people on the hill, around the hill, had. So I think there was an important point here, and particularly for Marilyn in the back there, that people from non-English speaking backgrounds, and one of the slight flaws, major flaws of this subject, is that Indigenous and migrant people are not given a very big voice. But people from non-English speaking background who are cut out of the loop by a variety of cultural and linguistic factors are actually real players. They're as real and as valuable as me or any one of us. And they do think, they do have values, and they do count. So these values, which is the first time I think that environmental values of people from non-English speaking backgrounds had been documented and presented to a commission of inquiry, had an enormous impact. I think I was just fortunate that I was there and I was able to provide the interpreters to do it. I don't think this was a stroke of genius by me. This was just a stroke of me having a creative understanding of how I could use the Department of Health's resources. So we collect all this information and we come to the day of the inquiry, and the day of the inquiry, BHP turn up with not one but two QCs, not one, not two, but three barristers and two instructing solicitors. I mean, it was like a scene out of, out of an American crime law show meets a bizarre science fiction movie. And then in walks the health department, me, with all the people from the Cringilla Coal Wash Time Protest Committee. The aforementioned unanimous hall last night overwhelmingly said the whole two of them came in, with notes in various languages to deal with this behemoth of a company and a behemoth of a proposal. And just simply by asking some questions, for example, the BHP speaker gets up on the 27th of November 1984, I remember it well, as you'll see in a moment, gets up at 2 o'clock and says that this should be used as a dump because no one uses it. No one walks on it, no one hunts on it, no one plays on it, no one does anything on it. And Cringilla has no sporting facilities, so if you'll let us dump the 8 million tonnes of crap, we will create basketball fields, we'll create soccer fields, we'll create barbecue pits, we'll create a whole range of things, which was the principal lure, along with the threat. If you don't let us do this, we'll close the steelworks. That was their principal argument. When I got up to say, and I produced a photograph to the Commissioner of why nobody used it, there is a sign at the bottom which says trespassers will be prosecuted. And I said to the Commissioner, no one's using it because there's a sign there. And the sign says, don't go. And what you're dealing with here, Mr. Commissioner, is the most law-abiding community in the Southern Hemisphere, who abides strictly by the law and respects the will of BHP to the nth degree. The barrister wasn't impressed. I was. So was the Commissioner. So it's the 27th of November, and I start to give the presentation at about 4 o'clock, and the next morning I'm to come back and give my final submission. And something interesting happens, because the aforementioned pregnant wife wakes at 7 and her waters break. So I'm thinking, I have an opportunity to go and deal with my mortal enemy, BHP, wife, waters broken, child, BHP, conflict, phone, 3 midwife friends of mine say, get around here quickly, Helen is about to go into labour, la 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 la. Zoom off to the Commission of Inquiry, tell the Commissioner what's happened, and I don't get to finish the inquiry because my wife eventually wants to go to hospital. 28th of November 1984, the day my son is born. I remember it well. And at the end of the day, the community, cut a long story short, the community wins. The Commissioner is not impressed. I won't bore you with the details, but the Commissioner is not impressed with the arguments of BHP. He's not impressed with the fact that they looked at no alternatives, both in terms of geographic sites, locations or technological processes to get rid of the waste, and basically says this ain't happening here. And then we go into negotiations with BHP for them to either sell or give back the land to public ownership so that this can never happen again. And BHP wanted this. They, in actual fact, in off-the-record discussions with them, they've said to me, if we'd have known what sort of crap we were going to run into, we would never have gone into this bargain. And the only person who wanted BHP to maintain ownership of this land and not give it to public ownership and have the botanic gardens created there and all the other good things that have occurred there was the late Frank Arkell, who was committed to the project more so than BHP. The moral of the story, I think, is multi. This is a story that operates at a zillion levels. First of all, it tells us something about the power of one agency. It tells us the power of an agency that can get too comfortable with a local council. And I think for probably far too long, BHP had been way too comfortable with Wollongong City Council. And this is not a story against council in Wollongong or against BHP. This is a story which I think has got a universal flavour to it. Secondly, it's got something to do with the law. I mean, the law said that in many ways BHP was entirely within its rights to do what it did. But when the law was fully expanded and fully extended, a la a Commissioner of Inquiry, then the law worked in favour of those residents. Now, we did suffer the spectre of government intervention after a Commission of Inquiry. There have been lots of commissions of inquiry that have come to certain conclusions. Some have said this project isn't happening, and the government has stepped in and says it is. And there have been some Commission of Inquiries which have said this project is happening, and the government has stepped in and said no, it isn't. So commissions of inquiry have got some powers, but not uber powers, not ultimate powers. So we did face this. But context being everything, this was a Labor government that I was able to have some contact with. I was able to have some entree with. If it had been a Liberal government, I'd have been dead in the water. And if this had been a Labor government now, if we'd have run this argument, same argument, but in a different time, I think I would lose. We would lose. I think context is important. And I think at the end of the day, what you've got here is a case study in the law. Yes, because at every step and turn, the law is involved in this. If it's not the Local Government Act, if it's not the Environment Planning and Assessment Act, if it's not a whole pile of other acts, at the end of the day, it's the law. But what we're also dealing with is not just the legal system, we're also dealing with justice. And I think at the end of the day, the Commissioner was able to see that while many of the ducks were lined up in favour of BHP, what wasn't lined up in their favour was justice. And that the company had not had any discussions with this company whatsoever. It had not put out any material in any language other than English, and it had grievously misunderstood the relationship between its employees and those employees who had a right to a private life when they weren't working in the mill. And worst of all for BHP, I think they totally misread the idea that people who are not white Anglos can actually have a view of the environment, a view which may well challenge and be grievously different from the values and attitudes of those people's employer, and that they can actually say it and not be deported back to Vitla, Ohrid or Belgrade. So at the end of the day, I think this is a story which, while it's basically a community-based story, I think it goes to the issue of what constitutes the law, who can have access to it, but what constitutes justice and how can that be mediated. And at the end of the day, the Cringilla Coal Wash Dome Protest Committee won this on the back of about 100 press releases, sending them out to the right people at the right time, having very little money expended on them and hiring not one lawyer to look at the case. So, thank you. So if you've got some Q&A, please go for it. Yeah.
Can I add something to your story?
Sure.
In 1974, I graduated as a social worker and came down here to work for the new Health Commission as the school and preschool social worker in Cringilla. So I started thinking, well, I'll carve out that sort of job. Within about a month, it was obvious that it was the most ridiculous job to have in Cringilla, and that I needed to be a community development worker, so that's what I did instead. There was no hall of any kind for people to use. Jarvie Road was where the trucks went then. You think that was small. It was not small. The steelworks were being very wonderful. They were within the school playgrounds. So all the coal wash went up in uncovered trucks up Jarvie Road. It was covered in black. The road, the houses, the women's washing, the kitchen, every single thing had black. You only had to walk down the street or visit somebody and you're covered in black. It was minutes to be covered in black. Anyway, I was still in preschool social worker. The Health Commission had not even a toilet or an office, so I based myself in the school. Then the Scouts had a scout hall, so I rang up the senior person in the staff at BHP who ran the scout hall. He said, oh, look, we like to have Christian people with Anglo background in our hall. We don't really want those people in the hall. I'm sorry, they can't use it for anything. So, well, I just want to have a playroom. No, I'm sorry, it won't be available. So, well, we don't do that. So then we thought, well, we could build a hall there. There was a big hog gap there. Why don't we just build one to get it cheap for? So I talked to the person from Tony Vinson's department, said, why can't we have a hall? And I wrote it. And he said, yeah, this is really good idea. So he talked to Wollongong Council, they said, we're not giving most people a hall. We're not having anything. And there wasn't even, there were no footpaths, there weren't street lights, people just lived out in the grass. There was nothing like what the rest of Wollongong was. It reminded me of Aboriginal places out in New South Wales, where they don't even get attacked. It was just like that. There was one English-speaking Australian born intact nuclear family in the entire suburb, and I was there. out for dinner, and with much alcohol. He explained to them there was Tommy Wren's special request, and if they would tick this, Tommy Wren would give Wollongong everything else they wanted. That's the way I have to say to them, really, it's Tommy, not Coke, he really wanted it. Tommy was very good at that, of course. And they gave it to them, and that's how they got the little board in the middle. And then people had formed this organisation, and meetings today, because nobody spoke English, and nothing was presented in both spoke, and we had 2 interpreters. But the person who made all the money out of Cringilla at the time went bananas, because the interpreters had the right to help at that stage, and you had to pay for absolutely everything, and some of that cost you. So there was document, there was interview, the hospital, we didn't know what she wanted. And he thought our setting up an opposition to him, and he was going to lose a lot of money. So Murphy was full of articles every week about how terrible the Cringilla community organisation was, because until Richardson came to talk to me and would know the council and said, oh goodness, I didn't understand it, I've had it all wrong. Then he came out and he actually chaired meetings for us, and that was when we got into trouble.
The other irony about Cringilla is that despite all the horror stories, this is the suburb where Bob Sediasis lives. He's a migrant who develops an eye for art, goes to Sydney, likes what he sees, buys a lot of paintings at bargain basement prices, which eventually becomes the basis of the Wollongong Art Gallery, and he bought some absolute gems at rock bottom prices. So his house, which was largely devoid of furniture, but had a fantastic art collection in the middle of this urban chaos, is a migrant who's buying the future of the Wollongong Art Gallery. Yeah.
Frank Arkell said, I've got this man in Cringilla, this Macedonian, coming out here all the time, writing about art. It couldn't possibly have art. He's watching us like, how am I going to get rid of it? And he just kept going backwards and backwards and backwards till they listened to him. But he went for maybe more than a year, history, to say that he had art where he actually had no room.
Oh yeah, he did. Whiteley's and others, and Tom Robertson's. Okay, any other questions, concerns, worries?
I've got another. Is that better?
Yeah. It's a little light on.
And other interconnection of the steelworks with other, like, I don't know whether it's government, but I bought a commission house in 1964, or bought a commission house in 1964, and they were all interconnected. You know, the council, the commission, housing commission, the rural bank, those outside bodies, they were all interconnected with the steelworks. They are all the migrants eventually, because they couldn't all live in Cringilla, got houses in Berkeley and Shell Harbour, and there was big areas which the steelworks proposed to the people who were working there.
Yeah. And I think if you go to the references from the first tutorial, the Floyd Hunter book, which was written in the 50s, about the relationship between municipal councils in America and big business, or if you go to the C. Wright Mills big book on power and business, and about how whenever businesses sat down to do business, all their legs under the table were intertwined because they were all, he actually coins the phrase, interlocking directorships. So, yes, but I think if you're embarking upon a community project, you kind of need to know this. You need to know these links, because it's a trite aphorism, but knowledge is power, and the more you can unpack this, the stronger your case becomes. Yeah.
Then you mentioned, or you said that BHP misunderstood the needs and values of the Cringilla residents. Do you believe that they were actually misunderstood or misrepresented? I mean, is there a darker side to it? I don't work for BHP.
No, I think at best they misread the mind of Cringilla. I think, I think there were some who were reluctant and apologetic misreaders. Once they found out later on that they had misread what was going on there, they were quite angry that they had been lured into a position that they really didn't want to be in. At the end of the day, BHP really doesn't want to fight. I mean, if it's going to have a fight, though, it will go into it full bore. But it really doesn't go around looking for fights. But I think there were some, certainly at head office, who basically saw the place as nothing more than a cash cow, and whatever drove the cash cow was good for business. So there were some who were looking at the bottom line, and the bottom line. The fact that there may have been humans attached to the bottom line, irrelevant. So I think for those good people at BHP Wollongong who misread, who were talking to me privately saying, I really wish we had not gone down this road. We were badly advised. If we'd have known what we were running into here, we wouldn't have touched this with a barge pole. Those people are clearly not out to walk over the community. But I think there are others who are saying, tough.
Excuse me, Glenn, we've got a question down here about as well.
Go, Karen.
This is a question from Neville.
Thank you very much, Jane. You talked about the comfortable arrangements between BHP and the council and no doubt others. But during that period, the differences were incredibly marked based on your explanation. Nowadays, anyone who's confronted with, particularly in New South Wales and especially here in Eurobodalla, I would wonder, I'd like your opinion, please, on whether government has been in power for the 14 or 15 years and the comfortable arrangements that might emerge and the culture that might develop as between both the state government, the various agencies, public service, and indeed local governments. Do you have any points of view on that? Because the experience that I personally had in Eurobodalla is that it's a very powerful influence over what's been going on here in Eurobodalla.
Okay, Neville, context is almost everything, as I said before. And in the 1980s, we had a particular unique set of contextual markers, if you will. We had a unique arrangement historically. It never had occurred before, never will happen again. It was unique to that period. And that was that we'd had a Labor government in power. It had been in power for some time. This is the end of the Rand government. And it had an interesting relationship with Wollongong Council. Macquarie Street at that time is desperate to undermine the power of Frank Arkell. Frank Arkell is about to sit, is ready to sit in Parliament as an independent. They need to knock his power off at every step and turn, and they need to keep Labor in no matter what. So what they're willing to do for the community and what they're willing to do against Arkell in particular, and maybe Wollongong Council in general, almost was boundless. So that was one thing. Secondly, that government by the time it gets defeated by Greiner, 1988-89, it's a very tired government indeed. It had gone through Rand and run its course through Unsworth, and it's starting to fray quite considerably. While it's beginning to fray, the special circumstances that Arkell and Council find themselves in Wollongong are starting to re-knit themselves in a very, very nice way, so that as one goes down, the other one is coming up. And that partly accounts for some of the political changes in Wollongong. For my part, though, when the Rand government is in power in 82, 83, it's a blessing for me because the Rand government was well known to this university. The Minister for Environment Eric Bedford, the then Minister for Environment, Eric Bedford, lived not far on the north coast at Kendal from where my PhD supervisor, Jim Hagan, lived. He had a property up there. So my getting access to Eric Bedford was a telephone call away. On top of that, Eric Bedford's principal advisor was a graduate from this university, and while he later serves a jail term for doing some interesting work involving land development on the north coast, before he goes to jail, he's a valuable pipeline for me and others into the Minister's office. On top of that, because I knew Jim Hagan, I was able to get access to other ministers very well. On top of that, I was able to play off the insecurities of Neville Wran beautifully. And that is this. When the CEP funding was to come to an end, the 13 members of staff that I'd hired off the dole queue, and we'd trained and we'd made into terrific ethnic health workers, and Wollongong at that time, under the Health Department's normal funding, had no ethnic health workers whatsoever, but I'd got 13, pardon me, I'd got 13 from Commonwealth funding. Wran came to a women's speak out at Wollongong High School Hall one Saturday morning. You could probably get the date. It was the date that Australia played someone at, might have been England in rugby union, and Wran was in a hurry to come to this meeting and get into his chopper, it was Packer's chopper, to go back to the lunch at the SCG to have lunch with Packer and then watch the game in the afternoon. So I got Mary Franks from Channel 4 and a cameraman to come and cover this meeting. And while the meeting's going on, I got someone to ask the question at the end of the CEP funding, would Mr. Wran be able to pick up the tab for the 13 ethnic health workers and continue their funding? This had never been done. All the projects were 12 months. When they came to an end, that was it. We then moved on to something else. There was no conversion of the CEP project to state government funding. So I got someone to ask the question, and Wran, this was after he'd had his Teflon operation, said, yes, of course. I didn't think that was good enough. So as he's leaving the hall and he's walking at double quick pace to the chopper, I get Mary Franks and the Channel 4 cameraman, I think it might have been Rob East, to follow me, and I knew Wran, kind of. As he's going to the chopper, I said, Neville, just before you get in the chopper, Glenn Mitchell, Health Department, Wollongong. Look, Neville, just to clarify what you were saying in the hall, and gave a signal to Mary Franks to roll the camera. Just to clarify, did I understand you correctly that when the CEP funding would end, that people from the CEP project would be retained on the Health Department budget? He said, yes, yes, of course, and then got in the chopper and flew off. Well, this is on camera, so I get Mary Franks to play this on Monday night. Then I get a whole pile of people to write postcards off to the Premier thanking him for his generosity. Then, this is in the week leading up to the budget. I ring an advisor on Wran's staff whom I know and say, dude, I'm wondering, have you put the line entry in the budget for the ethnic health workers in Wollongong? And he says, get stuffed. He says, we don't respond to this. I said, well, that's interesting. I said, your boss on Monday night is reported on Channel 4 as saying that when the CEP funding would come to an end, the Health Department would pick up the bill. Long pause at the end after this. I can't tell you what he said, but it was robust language. Phone gets slammed down, never talked to him again, and when the budget came out, those 13 people were fully employed and they're still working today. They're all located in a building down in what was the old ITC Nortel building for the South East Area Health Service. So, yes, the government did have a comfortable arrangement with a whole range of things, and for my purposes, it had a comfortable arrangement with me. And I was pleased and only too willing to operate on that, and if I hadn't have done that, if I hadn't have had that arrangement with those unique set of contextual arrangements, those people wouldn't have got a job and they wouldn't have been able to keep their job, and the Health Department wouldn't have been able to do what it did with people from non-English speaking backgrounds from that day to this.
But I think the point of the question here is the close relationships between councillors, mayors, members of parliament, where they protect each other's posteriors, and in fact, in my direct experience, that's getting worse. And I think this is what the gentleman from Eurobadala was talking about. I'll just mention one thing in passing here, that Ted Mack, for example, as Mayor of North Sydney, would not have his mayoral office in the council building.
Yeah.
He said, I'm not here to be massaged by the bureaucracy or represent the bureaucracy, I'm here to represent the citizens of North Sydney. Peter McDonald, as Mayor of Manly, took a leaf out of his book and did the same. Now compare what's happening in your local government area as to where the Mayor is and as to where the Minister is in Parliament, and say what you've got is this personal relationship between the bureaucrats and the elected representatives.
Yep.
Now in the case that you mentioned, you are doing the role, you took the role of an active citizen who, with lateral thinking and had resources, formed a group on leadership forum, an active group, research and integrity. You put those together under a leader who is supposed to be your local councillor, or is supposed to be your local mayor, or is supposed to be your local MP. And in my direct experience, if you find any of those people in elected office that do what you do, then you're pretty bloody lucky.
Yeah.
That's the situation that is faced in Eurobadala right now.
Right. I think the situation as I said, context is everything. We need to understand what was going on in the background of any event to fully understand what's going on. We need to understand what's on the backdrop of the stage to understand what the actors on the stage are doing, both then and now. In the case of the 1980s, I think I can honestly say that no one I know got any joy from any Labor alderman on Wollongong City Council. None. They were hopeless. They were not interested, as this was dealing with the most disadvantaged suburb in Wollongong. It was a write-off, and you had people like Harry Shipp and others who were so gung-ho to support the project that Labor, I don't think I got any support from Labor whatsoever. The only Labor person I had any support from for this was George Peterson, and it was because he was on the far left of the party and he was dealing with the dying light of the embers of the left in Wollongong, which had been crumbling since the death of Rex Connor, and he was trying to shore up branch support. In fact, he gets his fingers burned later on because one of the members of the Cringilla Coal Wash Dump Protest Committee, Alan Kalash, gets involved in recruiting so many members to the Warrawong branch of the ALP that I think it's considered to be branch stacking, and he's kicked out of the Labor Party and that branch was dissolved and all that. So I think George Peterson gave me a lot of help and did work behind the scenes, but that was because he's a left-winger and we're dealing with right-wingers, and I was dealing with the head office of the Labor Party that I'm not ideologically attuned to, and we were dealing with bozos in Parliament, you know, who were, shall we say, not at the cutting edge of intellectual creativity, you know. When I talk about people like Laurie Kelly and Eric Ramsey, I'm not talking about people here who have an environmental vision for a disadvantaged suburb in any way, shape or form. I might also say that I got that ironically, and Marilyn might want to take note of this, that not one environmental group came to the aid of the Cringilla Coal Wash Dump Protest Committee, as this didn't involve the desecration of a yellow-crested, you know, three-legged tree frog, as this didn't involve the desecration of the last stand of a rare tree, as it had nothing to do with that. This had to do with ordinary folk in an ordinary community. It was blinkered to environmental groups. So South Coast Conservation Society, little impact. The Total Environment Centre in Sydney, little impact. The two people who gave great support to this, far more than anyone in local council from the Labor Party or anyone in head office from the Labor Party, were Bob Brown, whom I got down here to give one of the lectures in the Rex Connor lecture series, and, ironically, Petra Kelly. We'd gotten Petra Kelly. Petra Kelly had come to Australia at the request of Bill Hayden. She was the founder of the Grünen, the Green Party in Germany. And she was an international star, and I'd been having conversations with her before she'd come to Australia. She came out here to do Hayden's bidding for anti-nuclear things. She was exhausted. She agreed to come to Wollongong. She agreed not to give the lecture. She gave the lecture to her lover, Gerd Bastian, who sadly later, because he had cancer, killed her and then killed himself. He gave the lecture in interesting German English, and then someone asked Petra Kelly a question and she gave a 2-hour lecture anyway. But I took her to the site and she was able to wax lyrical about the environmental amenity and the environmental value of the site in ways that no one from council could or would or did, and no one from head office in the Labor Party could or would or did. So while I agree with you, John, that relationships can develop between governments, councillors, developers and private agencies, in this particular case, the relationship between the government and council was not so great. The greatest relationship was the one between council, read Arkell, and BHP. That was the relationship. And that was a relationship driven by, in part, Arkell's ego, in part Arkell wanting to do BHP's bidding, in part because Arkell thought he could sell this project to the people of Cringilla as some sort of environmental and community facilities messiah. And even he misread the mood of people from the suburb that he alleged he was born in. Even he misread the mood. But the relationship, if there is a relationship here, it's not the relationship between Mitchell and Rann and Mitchell and Bedford or Mitchell and anybody else, and no one else from Cringilla and anybody else. It's between Arkell and representing council, and maybe not any of even Arkell's other independents on council, but particularly Arkell and BHP. That's the relationship. Jill.
Can you just turn off the document camera so we can see you in big form? Thank you.
Oh, it's not turning off. What am I going to do? No, it's not going to do. They'll have to deal with it as it is. Oh,
oh hi. It's Richard Nara again. An interesting story and a great victory. Thank you very much. We have a similar problem down here in Nara, I think, in that various authorities want to construct a fairly major dump just south of Nara at Tomarong. I'm not on the committee, but there is, I gather, a fair amount of community anxiety about this occurring down here. I'm not familiar with it entirely, but I personally, although I read the papers, the local rags 3 times a day, I'm not aware of any environmental research or investigation report that's been released on this. What do you think we could do down here without the incredible names and support by the international and national that you had in your fight against these authorities, and without the $500,000 grant as well? What can we in this suburb do to argue against this dump?
Right. Okay. Just to go back a bit, I wouldn't be so fixated on the amount of money and the grant that I got from the federal government. I think at the end of the day, sending off 500 letters is not going to cost a hell of a lot of money, and you wouldn't be sending off 500. But you'll be surprised at the number of people you can write to internationally who will answer you. I wrote to Tony Benn, who was then in the British government. He'd never met me, never been to Australia. And the dude, I've forgotten his name, the dude who was the head of the British Labor Party who didn't beat Thatcher at one of her electoral victories, who was from Wales and who had great experience with coal wash dumps, and he sent me back long, elegant and eloquent answers which I was able to use. So first of all, try and find some possible friends or people that you'd like to be friends with and start a postal relationship with them. Secondly, a famous epidemiologist, when I asked him about this project, said to me, there's only one question you need to ask of the proponents of this proposal, and that is, in what ways will this project advantage people's health? It's a very powerful question. And when I asked this question in the Commission of Inquiry, I'm pleased to say that the 2 QCs, the 3 barristers and the 2 instructing solicitors could not answer it. And their long, long silence, the longer it went, the better it got, their long silences had an impact on the Commissioner. And when they got up to finally go into the microphone, the Commissioner said, let me interrupt you, and if I could summarise your position, you don't know, do you? And that was it. And that was damning beyond belief. It's a very powerful question. I don't know the specifics of this project, but with any of these projects, there's always a weak link. There's always an entry point in which you can find your way in to start and unpack it. And I think you've only got to, if you look at, as I said in the first lecture, if you look at for your evidence and your eyes are trained enough, like C. Wright Mills said in that instructive little essay called On Intellectual Craftsmanship, suddenly your evidence is everywhere. Now, far be it from me to outline the tactics of the Liberal Party under Abbott vis-a-vis climate change, but if you see what he's doing, you'll see that the tactic is having an effect. He's not really putting up a proposal to replace Rudd's emissions trading scheme. All he's doing is throwing grenades into it to create a lot of mischief and a lot of doubt. And the polls are now, sadly, starting to swing his way. So if you can do to this project a similar thing, just keep throwing grenades at it, which create confusion, ask questions which people cannot answer, or which people have great difficulty in answer, you are on the road to victory, methinks. And no, I'm not available as a consultant.
Hi, thanks very much.
You might want to come to the microphone.
Yeah. Thank you.
That's okay. We've just got a question here from Wollongong. We've got technical matters. Okay, go. Yeah.
Oh, thanks very much. I'm interested in the human needs side of this, and was it so powerful because it was the first time that people had been exposed to the migrants' needs, and would it have been so powerful if this had been proposed in, say, a middle class area?
Okay, when BHP proposed,
Excuse me, we only caught the first couple of words of that question. Did you just read that for us? So we can follow the answer.
Okay, she's repeating it now, Karen.
I can't remember it. The human needs element of it. Was it so powerful because it was the first time that people had been exposed to migrants' needs? And would it have been so powerful or been effective if they had proposed this same issue in a middle class suburb? Okay,
well let's turn the question on the proposal on its head. BHP asserted that they had looked at Wollongong and found that this was the only 48 hectare site that they could put coal wash. Okay, so I did a quick drive around Wollongong one weekend and I found a couple of other 48 hectares, well, maybe not 48 hectares, but I found a large area of land at Mount Pleasant, Mount Ousley. And I said, I thought it should go there. This was clearly a site that didn't have any playing fields. This was clearly a site which had been neglected by council. This was clearly a site where young children are playing on the street, and wouldn't it be better to get them off the street? And of course, at this point, you know, outrage and anarchy breaks loose. It would be like saying, well, no, we don't need a nuclear reactor at Port Kembla, we might put it at Killara, and we might put it at Rose Bay or Elizabeth Bay. Well, that's never going to happen, and it's never going to happen because of power, class, influence, money, a whole status, and a whole range of other things. So, to answer the question backwards, the reason why Cringilla was chosen was because the proponents of the dump thought that this was a soft touch, that they had dumped there before, and many people at Cringilla believed that the BHP had built the Cringilla Public School. It came as a bit of a shock to them when it was pointed out to them that the Department of Education had actually built the school. Maybe BHP had dumped some waste there, but BHP had won a small victory with a small proposal in an earlier time, and then, like anything where you think if a little bit is good for you, then a lot must be really good for you, thought that if they could go bigger, they'd win more, and that's when they ran into problems. Secondly, I think it's it wasn't that migrants had never been consulted before. In Cringilla they had. This was one of the most micro-researched, sociologically surveyed suburbs in Australia. I mean, it was like every second day there was a, you know, not like Paul Keating talked about, in every pet store there's a talking parrot that knew about micro and macroeconomics. But it was every day you turned around there was a team of sociologists doing PhDs or masters from some university wandering through Cringilla with clipboards. So they had been surveyed before, but it was the first time that a face and a name and a sound had been put to the words that they were speaking. And I think without the Commission of Inquiry, no matter how elegant and eloquent a submission from anyone could have been, it wouldn't have packed the punch. It's quite something to get someone up in front of the two QCs, the three barristers and the two instructing solicitors, not very well dressed, in halting English, and tell the truth from the heart. That's very powerful stuff. So it's the venue, it's a whole range of things. It's not just that they were, it was the first time. It might have been the first time that they'd been given this confidentiality in camera where we're sneaking people in the back to talk to the Commissioner, and they're basically all saying the same thing. The Commissioner might have heard 50 voices, but really first voice was the same as the 50th voice. Wasn't just that, it was a whole range of things which, as I said before, I think if I was to rerun this case now, I don't think it could be won. I think it would be lost.
Can I just go on?
Sure. Press the mic thing again.
It's just because in my experience and the challenges that I'm having, when you address that human needs side of it, it's not having that impact. If it's in the policy or they can do it, they do it, and they're not interested, even when we talk about loss of life and things like that, it's just not having that impact.
Yeah, well, the other thing that there are so many contexts that this is occurring in. The other context is that migrant health is just beginning at this time. We've just had the Galbally report in the 1970s under the Fraser government. He honoured the promise that he'd given to Whitlam that he would continue with the inquiry. The Galbally report has unleashed millions of dollars, which goes all over Australia, but not to the Illawarra. We've become the last area to get a migrant health advisor, a healthcare coordinator, healthcare interpreters and ethnic health workers. We're the last region to get all of those. So that plays into our hands. And while all that's going on, me and colleagues are writing policy which is effectively boiled down to migrants should have the same access to health services involving an interpreter or an ethnic health worker that you or I have. Not any more access, but no less access either. And so the issue of equity and justice and all those other things, which at the beginning of their articulation has more punch than what we've got now. We've got an Ethnic Affairs Commission which has dumbed down. The word multicultural is not allowed to be used anymore, so migrant health is no longer top of the pop. So it's kind of run a cycle which I think if anyone tried to intervene in would be difficult to pick up on. It's just not there. It's sort of like having a crush on a girl at school and then going to a school reunion and seeing her again and saying, I'm glad that didn't work out. It's sort of, you might have been hot to trot in year 11 with the blonde in the back row, but when you go to the school reunion, you were thinking, what was I thinking? Because whatever I was thinking at the time, it's long gone, and I can't reclaim it.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, just going to ask Mark. Yes, Mark, go.
My question sort of relating back to culture change that someone was talking about before. And I do think John Hatton's point about independence and distance in relationships between stakeholders like different government organisations is a very good idea. But I guess wondering with your experience with BHP and BlueScope, where you've seen a genuine culture change over there, that environmental merit has merit rather than just a PR sort of greenwash effect on them. I also keep in mind there's been dwelling campaigns I'm aware of, the Almond Creek one and the copper smelter one over the preceding years. So have you seen any culture change with them? Do they really believe it, or are they just worried about the newspaper?
All right, okay. I guess in the last 20 years, the steelworks at Port Kembla has gone through several iterations. It's gone from BHP to BHP Billiton that didn't want a steelworks. We've gone from the potential closure of the steelworks under BHP, then BHP selling to BHP Billiton, something that no one thought would ever happen, and then BHP Billiton not wanting to be, it's a resource company, it doesn't want to deal with steel, and selling it off to BlueScope. So what you've got now is an entirely different organisation operating in an entirely different time, an entirely different context. So to compare BlueScope in 2009 to BHP in 1979 I don't know if I'm willing to do that. It's kind of apples and oranges. What I think I can say is that internally, the people that I've dealt with at BlueScope seem to be of a different order of bureaucrat and entrepreneur than the heavies that I was dealing with in BHP in 1979. To make this point, to give some legs to that, when I was doing my PhD, I interviewed every living company director of BHP, ranging from Sir Colin Syme, who'd been on the board for some 20 years, through to Sir Ian McClelland. And the first interview that I did was with Sir Ian McClelland, and I can remember it was on the first day of the centenary test match in Melbourne. I went to his office, it was a heat wave, and his office was set up like Mussolini's office in that it was a four-day march from the door to his desk. So by the time I got to his desk, it's a heat wave, I'm exhausted. And it was the first time I'd been into an office where plush carpet was sort of like almost covering my shoes, which I thought was coming from a house that didn't have carpet, only had lino. The being carpet that was going over my shoes I thought was a very interesting experience. So I sit down, I put the tape recorder on, this is pre-ethics days, and I start asking him the questions, and he says, in the middle of the things, he said, I don't understand, I don't like this line of questioning. And it was one of those epiphanous moments where time sort of stood still. All I could hear was the perspiration going from under my armpits onto the carpet. Like if it was a movie, I could see it going in slow-mo and splot, you know. And I'm just thinking, what do I do here? Like, this is my first interview. This is a crucial interview of my PhD. So I leaned over and I turned the tape recorder off and I said, with the greatest of respect, I don't tell you how to run BHP. I don't think you should tell me how to run my PhD. But if you don't want to agree to my interview, well, that's fine by me. I will put in my PhD. It won't hurt you. I'll put in my PhD. You fail to cooperate. And I started to pack my stuff up, and I'm thinking, that's it, I'm out of here, this has all gone to crap, it's going to be another PhD, I'll be doing a history of line dancing or something next, rather than a history of pollution. And he leaned over and he turned the tape recorder on and he says, no need to take that tone. Now, where were we? And I thought, whoa, what if I hadn't have asked that question? And then later on, as I'm going down in the lift, one of his flunkies comes into the lift and he said, so you've just done an interview with Serene, have you? And I said, yeah. He said, bit of a bastard, was he? I said, well, you know, that's putting it mildly. He said, oh, it was a test. He likes to try out people. And as I'm going down the lift, he's on the phone to every other company director saying, like, Darling and Syme and others saying, yeah, so he talked to him. It was an interesting interview. It was an interesting experience. His views, though, about pollution and that were mirrored by another company director I interviewed the next day, who's on the top floor of a big building. When I got to the top floor, I look out and say, this is a lovely view. And he said, he pulls his glasses down, exact words were, and said, yes, but we don't look at it. And I thought, this is going to be an interesting interview. And then articulates in the interview the phrase, exact phrase, it's on page 230 of the PhD, footnote, we don't give a stuff what goes on at Port Kembla, we're only there for the money. And I said, would you like me to rewind the tape, hoping that he'd say no? And he said, no. He said, what can you do to me? And I thought, right, thanks. So those attitudes, if anyone at BlueScope has them, I don't think they'd have the guts to put them on tape. So you've either got the same mindset at BlueScope now, and I don't think you do, but if you do, you wouldn't have anyone who would be so brazen and so lacking in astuteness to put it on tape. So there, I think, is your change.
Just following through the issue about BHP and the past and the present, it's not based on BHP, it's of big mining companies in Indonesia in particular. And there's a difference over time. When the early stage of BHP, there was lots of companies. Back to the issue about BHP in the past and the present in terms of environmental consciousness and so on. My experience was big mining companies in Indonesia, and in the past, of course, they were operating in an environment where in a general environment where environment as an issue simply wasn't a big deal in terms of the international community. Over time, it became such an issue that it was good business to look like you were really good with the environment. It meant shareholders, it meant actual money, it meant all sorts of things that eventually they had to pay a lot of attention to. There may well have been people who were fully committed inside, and that's some who definitely were. But basically, it was good business as time went on, as the culture changed around them. Absolutely. To be conscious of the environment, which it was not at the time.
Absolutely. And if we just want to continue the BHP story, when BHP first goes to Papua New Guinea to work on the Octedi mine, they move in and they mine and do what they do with complete and utter rapaciousness. When it becomes known that the toxic wastes are flowing downstream and are having a bad effect, BHP get the spin doctors to work on this and try and push it aside, and eventually this becomes so large that they can't stop it, and you have the former general manager of BHP Port Kembla, whose name I've forgotten, I can see his face, I can't remember his name, who was then gone on to become the chairman of BHP, Jerry Ellis, that's right, who was a man of considerable personal decency and who was privately revolted by a lot of the things that he had to be associated with via his company, eventually confronts the media and says, we've screwed up, we've done horrible things, we've done so many bad things here, this is a disgrace to our company, and I'm now writing the cheque for compensation. He not only did that because it made good business, and my guess is that if you looked at the share price that afternoon, it would have gone up. Not only did it have good business, but you also tapped into the unknown, which is he goes beyond the corporate and he goes into a little bit of the personal. Okay, are there any other... Yeah, please. Yeah. Jill, go. No, go. Please. Sorry.
It sounds
about consciousness raising as an important issue, but in the fundamental talk about power relations, yes, consciousness raising seems to be an important issue here, and a clarification of communication between different groups, seeing as we're talking about power relationships between humans and personal interests. So from your particular case study, Glenn, are there any lessons to learn about human nature and political interests in communication, ways we communicate with each other, lessons that you've learned to make a better future?
Yeah, I think so. I don't go back to Cringilla anymore. I'm not the sort of ex-boss that goes back every 6 months to check on my former staff. I think I might have been back once, and I don't go back. When I left. I wish them all the best. And I don't go back because I don't need to go back. They're good enough to look after themselves. So that's my staff that I recruited, good enough to do things by themselves. They're all bright. They're all going on and doing university studies, and they're far brighter than me. They've got 2-3 languages. I've only got one. I can swear really well in Macedonian. I mean really well, but that's about it. As for Cringilla itself, I don't go back there much either, unless I want to show visitors what was going to be destroyed and what was saved. I don't think I've been back to the community co-op since at Cringilla, and I don't need to, because what the coal wash dump did was unlock a whole pile of stuff. So people started to engage with the business of submission writing. People started to engage with the business of getting more staff on. People started the business of actually ringing up the general manager of BHP and going over and talking to him. People started to engage with the business of having greater political interactions with their local politicians, their ward aldermen and all of that. So the spin-off effect in terms of community development and community empowerment was pretty good. I don't think Cringilla will ever be the Kalara of the South, where it will win on a minute-by-minute basis. But I don't think it's any more the suburb that will be pushed around. There are still significant problems in Cringilla, though. There are still large numbers of unemployed. There is still a significant drug problem. There's still a significant hooker problem. There's still a whole pile of significant problems. But the difference between then and now is that A group of people that doesn't include me are able to identify those. B, a group of people that doesn't include me are able to go and have a go at solving them. And C, a broader group of people, which doesn't include me, no one rings me, no one, and I just don't have anything to do with them anymore, really, are capable of identifying and getting on and doing their own things in their own way. So that, and when the new blast furnace was built, the one that's at the back of Steel Street, BHP and the community were able to negotiate building times, descriptions of what was going to go on in the blast furnace and noise levels in community languages, da-da-da-da-da. That wouldn't have happened, I think, had it not been for the coal wash dump. So I think the lesson is that this had a far bigger spin-off effect, a long-term spin-off effect of raising people's consciousness and saying, getting people to think, whoa, well, we can actually have a go at this. We can actually do something about this, and the sky isn't going to fall in. That's a good victory, I think. Yeah.
I just wanted to know, in the 70s, I thought the unions were strong. Where were the unions during this period of time?
Right.
Did they stand? Did they support you, or did they head to the stand?
As the trucks were going to be driven by TWU workers, it did not have the support of the Transport Workers Union. As the coal wash was going to be loaded by members of the FIA or members of the Miscellaneous Workers Union, did not have their support, did not have the support of the South Coast Labor Council. And when submissions came to be given to the public inquiry, the South Coast Labor Council was not a group that went and supported, gave a submission in support of people at Cringilla. And if you look at the work that the Jobs for Women campaign did, I think you'll find that the union contribution there was somewhere between 0 and 0 as well. No, I think well, another contextual factor is that the Labor Council itself was undergoing some considerable change. You had an elderly leader in Merv Nixon who was ill and whose political influence and capacity to do a day-to-day job was failing. You had other younger people coming through who wanted a slice of action, a slice of power, and are more than willing to kill him off politically. But I think, without wanting to defame the South Coast Labor Council, it had a bigger fish to fry in that it was losing large numbers of its members at the steelworks. You know, the construction of a coal wash dump, which kind of was a bit more esoteric than the retaining or the pushing forward of jobs, wasn't something that they wanted to engage with. Really, they had another agenda.
You were saying 28 years of so in the 25 years of community action, I have learned a few things. And one is that you need networking. You need people who know what they are talking about. The more information you have, the better it is. And another thing is you need passion for what you believe in and what you want to do. Now, coming back to the steelworks as such, we had actually a great problem from the 50s to the 70s with the old Australian steelworkers who had a position in the workforce which was very slowly changed over those 20 years from the younger people who came and went to the university.
It's very annoying, that's all.
And so this in the unions and this in the workforce itself, there was always a certain amount of rivalry between the new Australians and the old Australians.
Yeah, and at this time you have a significant change in the worker culture and the worker numbers at the steelworks. So we go from the mid-60s of 30,000, almost 30,000, where it was you could be guaranteed a job at the steelworks. You could be guaranteed a job any day of the week, almost in any part of the steelworks, particularly the coke ovens. If you wanted a job, you could always go and get one, even though it may well ultimately cost your life and it was dangerous. But come the recession, the old ways of doing things the steelworks has to get rid of. It has to retool, it has to embrace contemporary technology, it has to embrace computer technology, and it has to get away from a labour-based operation to a technology-based operation, and that, sadly for humans, involved the loss of several thousand workers. But the workforce there now, 5,000, let's not kid ourselves, I think if BlueScope could get the operation down to one human being, they would. But the 5,000 who are there now, I think, are younger, they're smarter, they're a bit more hip to what's going on, and they're producing a product which arguably is better than the product that was being produced by 30,000 men. And I think that company now sees also that the old ways of doing things, the divide and rule, keeping people disempowered on the line, keeping people away from those things which will make a better employee and thus a better company, they're not willing to go down that road again, I think. Sarah.
I just had a thought, and it was to do with the Labor Committee comment about the unions. And I've just been observing what's been happening with the South Coast Trade Labor Council now and the media. And it was interesting that they didn't play a part in what was a major community issue at the time, and their charter was like protecting the rights of workers. But I see in our current times, because there isn't an elected community leader of Wollongong, that the South Coast Home Labour Council is asked by the media to comment on basically every community issue. And I think it's been an interesting change or attitude that's occurring, and just how representative of the broader community is that opinion.
Well, I mean, you've got, at the beginning of the 1980s, you've got a workforce which is 70% unionised, and you go now to 2009, you have a workforce which would struggle to where 15% of the workforce would be unionised. That is a significant drop. That's a drop of 55%. Or put another way, the overwhelming majority of the workforce in Australia no longer believes that a trade union is the best way for them to move forward. You'll find that it's not only the South Coast Labour Council that's being bypassed. Can anyone here name me the secretary of the ACTU? Don't rush me. Who's the president? What's the name of the president? Deputy Secretary. There was a time when the Bill Keltys and the Cliff Dolans were commonplace. These names are now no longer commonplace. You know one of them, Sharon Burrows, but you don't know the other. The dude that was sent from head office in Sussex Street to Melbourne. I think I'd have to think fast to remember his name myself. So the ACTU is being bypassed as a voice in big national affairs, just as the way the South Coast Labour Council is. And I guess the media is in the business of selling papers, selling product, probably doesn't need them.
But I think jumped into a vacuum at the moment because there's no elected mayor at Wollongong, and I see him making a comment on behalf of the community, and I just have noticed this trend of late, and it's just interesting to change the time.
Well, as articulate as Arthur Rorris is, and he's a graduate of this esteemed university, he's not coming from a stronger position as previous secretaries of the Labor Council may have in the 50s, 60s and 70s, when a unionised workforce meant something.
Arthur Rorris is pretty well respected and he is articulate. And I think the main reason, and it's a lot different to Paul Matters days where he wanted to buy a second-hand car, he went to consult with Paul Matters, he was throwing on everything. There is you're quite right, there is a vacuum. There is a complete loss of community groups around a place like Wollongong. The service clubs don't operate in anywhere near the same way. And I think that we feel a loss now because there is no democratic voice within the council. That's right true.
Yeah.
Then can I just bookend your case study? I guess I'd like to know where did the coal dump go? What effect did it have on the community where it ended up?
Okay, just to wrap this up, one of the principal planks of BHP's case was that they had investigated every place on the planet and that only this place in Cringilla was capable of taking it. There was nowhere else in the world that could take their coal wash and steel waste, especially on site, that they had run out of space internally. When asked, could you please explain, to do the Pauline Hanson thing, please explain, and we raised the issue of 21 dump, Steelworks just went, right. The world didn't fall in, the steelworks didn't close, and they continued to produce waste, and they continued to disposing of it, and they disposed of it at 21 dump. They disposed of nearly all of their coal wash waste and associated steel slag waste and all the other things on their own premises.
I was just going to ask you where is 21 dump?
21 dump is as you're going along the southern distributor, it's on the left-hand side. As you're going along Spring Hill Road and you get towards the Cringilla turn-off, it's on your right-hand side. As you're going along Five Islands Road going west, heading towards the southern distributor, it's on your right-hand side. And as you're going, and as you're going as you come to the Jack Kimber Bridge at Coniston, which links Fig Tree with Spring Hill Road and the Southern Expressway, it's the big mound on your left. That's 21 dump. I don't know where dumps 1 to 20 are, but I know where 21 dump is. Yeah. Okay, last question.
As the president of the West Gap Rural Ratepayers Association, I assume the answer is already in the year 2000. I've read the history of the Don't Dump Gap Commission of Inquiry, and it's all there, and it's in a mountain.
It's not in West Gap as well.
A mountain, I was in West Gap.
Okay, it could be 22 dump. Look, I was only protecting the rights of Cringilla. Just leave me alone. Okay, thank you very much.